Hello, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos. I hope everyone's having a great day so far. Today is Tuesday, October the 20th. Want to thank you for supporting our multi-channel network. Without you, we literally wouldn't be here. So thank you for that. And very excited for today's broadcast. Today, I'm joined by London Paul of the Sears Report. Please make sure to go over to thesearsreport.com and support Paul also with his work. Paul's also very active on Twitter as well. Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. It's quite amusing when we do this countdown. It's almost like this, and this broadcast will self-destruct in 10, 9, 8, 7.
You're like, do I stay here or do I run?
Yeah. But yes, no, yeah, we're very well. It's kind of just, crazy times in a lot of ways, but we just get on with life and ignore it all because that's the only way any of us can sort of deal with this. But so how about yourself?
I'm doing great, Paul. Very excited for the I guess, if you will, we're coming to the top point of what the election cycle here is in the United States. But the family, everyone's doing great. Really nothing to complain about. Just some recent events that have happened the past. It's been probably obviously more than 2 weeks or so forth. But it just kind of reminds me, Paul, at this point when we're seeing some of the negotiations in regards to the United States and Russia, just going back in history a little bit and looking at JFK and his efforts to really curtail the limited nuclear test ban treaty that he was able to successfully do with Russia, which ultimately was part of, I guess, if you will, the military-industrial complex, and just how upset they were with JFK's efforts to broker this deal with Russia. And history always doesn't necessarily repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And here we are, Paul, with kind of back in that same situation a little bit. So I thought it's definitely worth the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, you make an extremely interesting point with regards to JFK. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was one of several reasons why he was clearly assassinated by interest in the United States. I mean, that's not conspiracy theory, that's just fact. And yes, the military-industrial complex has always been part of this, and we've discussed this, and we won't elaborate on that too much. But the basic premise is that it drives American foreign policy in huge amounts of ways. Why? Because they want to make enormous profits, justifying selling arms to allies, or just justifying spending $750 billion a year on pointless pursuits. As I think Jack Ma summed it up best when he said, well, imagine what America could have been like if they hadn't wasted trillions of dollars on pointless wars. And in a very crude sense, pointless is the right word. But there's always been this big idea to put enormous pressure on Russia, and it has had no effect. Particularly, I would say more so since Putin became president in 1999. During that sort of collapsed period of when the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s, we had literally just carnage in what was the former Soviet Union. And then when he took over, things started to change. But the pressure exists because the one thing, the Western Empire, which is how I'm trying to phrase things these days, for want of a better description. And we said this before, but it's worth reiterating, has never wanted Germany and Russia, Eurasia, to come together. Because when Eurasia comes together, it's the end of the Western Empire. And I know people get a bit annoyed at times when I say that, the British Empire fell apart at the end of World War II. That was the end of it. It was the US that took the mantle. I'm not saying there aren't elements in Britain, in Europe that aren't part of it, but predominantly the whole balance of power shifted to the US. And of course, they were responsible very much for modern day Europe, which was to try and keep Russia at arm's length. So it was always pushing NATO towards Russia's borders, putting missiles on Russia's border. Russia had to be the convenient sort of bogeyman. It later became China and Iran and North Korea and other nations, but that's always been the principal focus. So look at the last sort of 6 years. I mean, we had the Ukraine Maidan as one example, which was to try and force Russia into economic destruction. It tried to force them into a war in Ukraine, which, contrary to Western popular wisdom, Russia's never been in Ukraine. That's nonsense. If Russia went into Ukraine, the war would be over in 24 hours. They'd be at the gates of Kiev, and that would be the end of that. But they wisely, took one step out of that, went, no, we're not getting involved. Belarus is another recent example where there was clearly a color revolution planned by the US and Ukrainian intelligence, which has failed. We've said they keep putting missiles on Russia's borders. There was all the economic sanctions. Maybe we'll actually talk about another time the sort of developments of the MH17 debacle, which kind of reached a farcical sort of not conclusion, but impasse of several days ago. But the whole purpose of that is to keep Europe apart from Russia, because, as we said, when they pull together, that's the end of the Western Empire. I mean, you talk about moments like the dollar collapsing and all these other geopolitical, economic, financial events, but predominantly once Europe wriggles free from the constraints of the Western Empire, for want of a better word description, but I think it aptly covers it in more detail than just portioning all the blame on the US, which is not the case. Then that's it. So but the intention for years and the idea that Trump's some kind of lapdog of Putin's farcical, because during the Trump administration there was a never-ending sort of pressure put on militarily, in terms of sort of propaganda information. Well, we had all the sort of Skripal nonsense, we had the Navalny nonsense, we had economic, financial pressures put on, all in the idea of trying to cause the Kremlin to collapse or capitulate. And the big design, not exactly the whole of Putin's presidency, and okay, he had the short spell as prime minister and went back to being the president, was to try and get into cave into US hegemony as Europe capitulated. Really, sort of the end of World War II in particular. I mean, that's when Europe effectively, not entirely, but became a vassal continent for the US, just to play with it as it wanted, to try and justify enormous military expense, and as we said, use Russia as this convenient scapegoat. Well, of course, there's always ongoing reports that come out with regards to trying to keep these tensions going, even when you could arguably say on some level there might have been an opportunity for rapprochement between Trump and Putin. I don't dispute at one point there was a bit of camaraderie between them, but that was quickly extinguished. I don't think that's particularly anything to do with Trump, but Trump was consumed by the machinery of the Beltway, and that was the end of that. So, of course, they have to keep this notion of military pressure, propaganda, cyber warfare, economic, financial pressure, and maybe I'll just stop there, and then you can obviously, provide your insight so far.
No, I think you're spot on in the assessment and things that have occurred, and leading up to this point. It's just been very interesting the past few years, as much as we have really kind of condemned or rebuted some of the foreign policy things that have occurred with Russia, with China. And we know that every effort that the administration, that Trump has made to really establish some type of formidable discussions or open dialogue with Russia have just been, just spearheaded. They've never allowed that to continue. So it's very interesting that to this date, leading into this election, that they're still continuing that effort, Paul.
Yeah, and there's, if you look at the Atlantic Council, there's always certain sort of bodies that come out and make statements, and it's always worth paying attention because it's reflective of the sort of Beltway, belief of how things should be conducted. And despite everything that's going on, they kind of came out and said, we think there needs to be a more proactive kind of relationship between, even though the relationship between the US and Europe is collapsing, they want to see an even stronger alliance between Europe and the US in terms of sanctions against the Russian economy, against Putin's perceived power base, reduce, hence the Nord Stream 2. That's where that idea came from. And that's collapsed in a heap because Europe's going, well, actually, we want control of our own energy, national security. Because bear in mind, not a known fact, and I tweeted about this, is that the US doubled its amount of oil imports from Russia in 2019. And it's now the second largest importer of Russian heavy oil. I mean, as I said, if you could bottle hypocrisy, the US would be the richest nation in the world. And while they're saying all this about, well, we want to curtail, Europe's relationship, and also it's to try and drive more wedges between Europe and Russia. So Europe's like kind of the meat in the sandwich, but the US will do whatever it needs to do for us. So basically, the Germans came out and went, well, you look after your energy policy, and we'll look after ours. But of course, the US needs Europe on side. It needs Europe to try and reinforce everything Russia does in terms of sanction policy. And then, of course, there's all this disinformation that whenever something happens, I mean, the latest one is that Russia apparently tried to interfere in what would have been the Tokyo Olympic Games in 2020, which, of course, again, everyone in the West laps up because, of course, it must be true. So they want Europe to ratchet up, sanctions related to Ukraine, towards Crimea. They want them to extend sanctions. I mean, I don't know what's left in terms of sanctioning Russia, but anyway, and literally to say, well, we're not going to think about renewing them every year or 6 months. Let's do it indefinitely. So, it's just like this never-ending barrage where it's like, we want you to put more and more weapons in Poland, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Baltic republics. The list goes on and on and on. And what's kind of reinforced this view and strengthened it is because they think a few years ago, well, Putin will be gone soon. We'll get a more sort of transatlanticist Russian president. And now they're going, oh, actually, we may have Putin in for years because they changed the constitution. And therefore, they're going, well, we need to go for even more enforcement against Russia. And of course, Putin and the Kremlin and Lavrov, etc., just sit there going, what the hell are you doing? And you're insane. Do you really think we're going to fall for yet more, constraints you want to try and put on us? But the one slight difference is whilst Russia seems amenable to, and we'll talk about the whole START treaty thing shortly, they're also getting absolutely fed up because their attitude is, you're not interested in having discussions with us. Everything you're trying to do is undermine us, constrain us, destroy our economy, try and cause serious political disturbances in our own nation. You're trying to undermine our technology. And we've reached the point where we've just had enough of this because they're publicly coming out going, your behavior is completely inappropriate. I think they've used terms such as outrageous. And rightly so, because what's the point in saying, well, we want to enter into dialogue with you? And America just makes up a load of nonsense and says, well, we're doing it, it's our way or the highway. And in the end, Russia's walked away from most things and said, what's the point? We're not going to bother having discussions with you because all you're interested in doing is trying to destroy legitimate competition, impose illegal sanctions on us, try to create serious geopolitical problems on our borders, and therefore, from our perspective, you're not interested in international law. So it's about time we sort of moved on, and we'll wait for you to sort of grow up and behave in a mature, sensible manner. The thing that's also caused the US a huge problem, and it's kind of ironic, they walked away from the 1987 INF Treaty, and now they're threatening not to renew the START Treaty, which we'll come to in a second. On the back of this, we've said before about Russia's military superiority. And the West knows this. The US military knows this. NATO knows this. So Russia sat there going, well, we have the military superiority. You know we have it. Therefore, you're never going to actually follow through with your threat to launch any missile strikes on us. I mean, they can't say to the Russian people and dismiss it as being trivial, because the Russian people would sit there and go, you got to take this seriously. But on a certain level, whilst that you will take it seriously to some degree, they know in reality that the US is never going to threaten them militarily, because the consequences will be catastrophic. But we'll come to the START treaty in a second, because obviously, again, I don't want to just keep waffling away and you don't have any
Oh,
input. But what's very clear is, from the Russian perspective, is as far as they're concerned, the US just abuses, whatever international rules and an international order. Careful how I say this, because that's not a new world order, but there has to be some international rules and regulations. And as far as they're concerned, the US breaks it repeatedly. And therefore, we're not going to bother negotiating with you unless you're prepared to meet us at the table, discuss things amicably, reach a solution whereby we both agree to this, and you're not trying to enforce your strange sort of perception of what is morally correct or legally correct. But the START treaty, kind of, there's an impasse, but there might be a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. But we'll talk about that in a second.
No, I completely agree, and I think through the U.S. actions in specifics, with NATO, I've just been continuously amazed at the efforts of Russia, of Putin, to withstand not only the covert actions but also the sanctions, the continued efforts to really derail Russia as an influence globally. And as the Moon of Alabama specifically states, that the more pressure that the U.S. will continue to put on Russia will literally have no effect, Paul. It just simply won't.
Well, no, and I can remember in 2014 when the Maidan happened, and we were in discussions with people, and they went, "Oh, this will be the end of Russia." I said, "It won't. It'll be the end of Europe. It'll be the end of Europe's relationship with America. It's really the beginning of the end of NATO, because Russia knew full well what was coming. They knew a long time before the Maidan happened. And therefore they just sat there and went, okay, you want to, if you sanction us, well, we'll just, diversify our trade. Europe's the one screaming now that it's lost Russian business. German companies are furious. Austrian companies, the list goes on and on and on, because they're the ones suffering as a result of this crass policy that when it suits the US, they'll trade with Russia happily, and they'll just not tell anyone they're doing it because it suits them. But they tell the rest of Europe, if you break these sanctions, we'll sanction you. So increasingly, US foreign policy with regards to Russia is blowing up in their face, just because Putin does sit there and plays the chess game and looks at it and goes, well, we just have to play the long game, do nothing, because, or as I use my analogy, they'll just hand the US a spade or keep digging a hole for themselves. And of course, the US gleefully does this, thinking Putin's doing it from a position of weakness.
Correct. Well, whether it's Nord Stream 2, that he still has been able to effectively work, with Germany, or more eye-opening here recently is the testing of the defense missile system by a NATO member, such as Turkey. Those things are very eye-opening that a lot of people missed out on, but that was very eye-opening to see a NATO member and a U.S. ally testing Russian military equipment, Paul.
Well, yes, because I remember at the time people said that'll never happen. So it will. They'll buy the S-400s and then they'll test them. And I mean, you might as well say that Turkey being in NATO is farcical now, but geostrategically, they can't afford to let them go. And because if they let them go, they'll run completely into the arms of Russia. I mean, Erdogan's Erdogan, and he tries to bend with the wind, although course, he hasn't forgotten who tried to have him, removed, and even not just, in a coup. I think they would have tried to have him killed. But yes, there was also on Putin's birthday, Russia tested the Zircon missile intentionally because they're just saying to the West, we have this technology. You think we have an S-400 and a 500? Well, we have an S-700. As someone accidentally or deliberately let slip once about the development on the S-700. So there are always iterations ahead, and Russia just strategically does these things. So we come to the START treaty, which is due to expire February next year, and the US tends to walk away from these treaties, claiming that Russia's in breach of them, when in fact the US is in breach of them, because as soon as the US walks away from the 1987 INF treaty, they then start testing all sorts of missiles, which is in breach of it. So I mean, the world's looked at this and gone, hang on, it's pretty obvious you're the one who's walked away blaming Russia. Well, as I say, the START treaty expires next February, and recently Putin came out and said, look, let's just extend the treaty for 12 months. No conditions applied. Because, as he said, it would be very sad if the treaty ceases to exist without being replaced by another fundamental document. So, the new START worked, well, in inverted commas. How many thousands of nuclear warheads do you need before you destroy the world? But anyway, it's by the by. So it is true, it has limited and to some extent, well, controlled an arms race. But you get to the point, as I say, how many more thousand nuclear missiles are going to make any difference when we see the destruction of what one can achieve? But anyway, he came out and said, okay, look, we're happy to do this. Robert O'Brien, who's the national security advisor in Washington, said that the Trump administration agreed on the timeline for an extension, but it said that it renewed its demand that Moscow had to agree on a 1-year freeze of its entire stockpile. That included classes of nuclear weapons, note, that are not covered by the treaty. And we know why the US has done this, because it's seen all these, the Zircon missile testing, all these hypersonic missiles. Well, that's not included in the treaty. And they're terrified that Russia will completely continue to stockpile these weapons, which the US has zero answer to. The US is a sitting duck when it comes to me. So they said, well, we made this proposal. We want to extend, yes, for a year, but Russia's going to have to cap nuclear warheads for a year. So in essence, they were kind of going, well, we want to include this in the equation because we're so frightened of what capability you would have. So in principle, you could argue if you excluded that and if you capped all nuclear warheads during the period, then the US makes a valid point if that's their intention. And that the problem is, do you trust the US intention? That's a difficult question. But if they did, yeah, and both sides win. The Russians, they thought, were willing to accept it. And then, of course, Putin comes out, we're not going to freeze nuclear warheads. So therefore, the US said, well, this is a non-starter. But the ultimate goal for the US is they want to replace the New START treaty, which is why they're trying to walk away from it, with a treaty that limits non-strategic weapons or limits them, of course, or tactical nuclear weapons. I think what it wants to do is try to put hypersonic missiles in there. It, of course, wants to include China, and China's basically said, go away, we're not interested. Don't drag us into your, treaty with Russia, because we know exactly what you're trying to do. You want to inhibit our ability to defend the South China Sea. Now, whether we agree with what China's doing, that's not the point. The point is, that is what China is telegraphing, and therefore they're saying, we're not interested. I mean, they even admit that they wanted to get China involved. China basically said, go away, we're not interested. But they seem to be keen on the US on some level, at least, to try and get a US-Russia arms control deal. Now, well, yes, because they've realized the hypersonic missiles is something that's a major problem. There is a point that you would argue that Russia will bide their time until the election, because as unlikely as Biden winning is, he's already said, look, I'll extend the treaty, no preconditions for 5 years. Let's start to work upon a follow-up, pact on this, which actually is logically makes sense. 5 years, maybe not, maybe 2 years, but actually say we need to start working immediately, and we can, we don't need to complete the 2 years. Maybe we'll do it a year, and then we can have a new treaty. And okay, I agree that treaties from time to time should be amended, but I mean the fact, I think it limits each country to around 1,500 deployed nuclear warheads and 700 deployed missiles and bombers you guess the point. How much, as we say, how much more can you limit the number of weapons, given what, as we said, what each one can do, capability of destruction. So, as he said, if Putin came up with the idea and the US has walked away from it, but what was interesting, Lavrov came out back end of last week and said, we're not really convinced that we can reach a deal on this because Russia won't accept conditions the US put forward for its extension. So, the one of the main ones is they won't accept the US demand to have this intrusive verification. I mean, of course, that existed in the 90s in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, where quite literally inspectors could go and look at missile factories and deployment sites, which, of course, from Russia's perspective now, it's an absolute no-go, and they're not going to agree to that. So in principle, it seems like they're very far apart still. There isn't any chance or the belief that this is feasible. I mean, the argument would be for Trump to come now and say, well, yes, I'll accept your offer for 1 year's unconditional extension. It might actually go against him when it comes to the election, because people the opposition will say, well, you're just rolling over to Russia, which of course is nonsense. Oh, it's part of the Russiagate. It's part of, that Putin has Trump in his back pocket, all that kind of nonsensical rubbish.
Paul, if I could pause you there for a minute.
Yes.
There's a couple of different perfect examples of exactly what you just said. So here recently, and we don't have to jump into details, obviously, because we could probably turn it into another hour discussion. But you're right, you are seeing that. So it's amazing how they try to spin the intelligence group coming together and saying, well, that's impossible. That Hunter Biden is a complete Russian disinformation campaign. And then also here recently, I'm sure that you're aware of this as well, and that's in regards to that. Here recently that the U.S. Just announced charges against Russian intelligence officers, what they deem as major, quote unquote, major cyber attacks. So continuously along the way, they're trying to insert themselves and disrupt the conversation. So you're spot on with that.
Yeah, and it's always been, because, I mean, here's the thing: if the US and Russia normalized relations, which it shouldn't be difficult to do this. Okay, the problem is it's so ingrained in most people's perception in Europe, the UK included, of course, and the US about the belief in what Putin is, what Russia is. So there's a big, huge ideological challenge. But if tomorrow you normalize relations, who's the big loser in this? Well, not European people, not the American people. It's a military-industrial complex, because immediately the bogeyman's gone. Oh, well, why are we pointing all these missiles at Russia if we're normalizing relations? If we're going to start, agreeing to slash missile technology in Europe, or in Russia, we're going to scrap these quotas, and eventually we're going to just de-escalate all the tension and get rid of all the nuclear weapons in pointing at each other. Okay, I'm not saying this is a bit utopian, but if we follow this to the logical conclusion, the military-industrial complex doesn't justify having bases in Europe. NATO would no longer need to exist. All the nuclear missile technology, all the new technology would be started to be deemed a bit redundant and irrelevant. So they're the big losers. So in all these situations, it's always the first thing: who stands to gain financially from this, and who stands to lose. So obviously they stand to lose. But what was interesting is I think it came out maybe even today. Suddenly out of the blue, Russia came back and said, well, look, we'll have a 1 year extension to the START treaty, but we're ready to freeze our current arsenal. Now, of course, as we go back, because the Trump administration said, well, we're not going to extend it without conditions. And, and that includes obviously capping the number of nuclear weapons. Well, when they say they'll freeze its current arsenal, what does that actually mean in principle? What's the fine print in that regard? But of course, if it's willing to commit to a nuclear freeze during the extension, it does so also as long as, and it knows the US only too well, it's going, just don't make any new demands. Look, if we agree to this, we agree to this. So whether they agree is an entirely different matter. But of course, as we know, it puts a limit on all this missiles, but it doesn't limit other types of nuclear warheads apart from strategic nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, etc., etc. And of course, the question is, freezing within the context of what's in the START treaty might be unacceptable because the US wants to broaden the remit to include presumably hypersonic missiles, etc., etc. So, Russia wants to extend it. I think in principle, elements, well, the US certainly wants to, or some of them, but are they going to? What's the chance of this actually happening? Well, it's marginally more improved. But I mean, it comes back to this point that at least Russia said, okay, we'll accept, we're not going to extend. We'll put a freeze on nuclear arsenal. But the question is, does that include all this modern technology, all the hypersonic missiles, which isn't covered by the treaty, and it's the US's biggest problem, and it's debatable. But the question now is, okay, does anything happen before the election? I mean, if I was in Russia's shoes, I'd go, well, I've got nothing to lose. I might as well wait till after the election. If the US wins, if Trump wins, nothing's changed. If Biden wins and he's actually committed to a 5-year freeze, well, let's do that because at least that gives everyone some room to breathe, so to speak. But again, this is the question where who's really driving this policy, because ultimately we come back to this issue of who really governs, governments, who's really pushing the Trump administration in this regard. And again, it's people talk about different. A lot of this whole idea of a deep state, it's just big trading, it's big commerce, it's big, industry drives US policy. That's a big proportion of what the so-called deep state is, and militarily, they push the odds. So it remains to be seen, if that is agreed upon, because internally within the US, it's not going to be the Trump administration that makes this decision. Someone's going to sit there and go, well, is this okay? Do we benefit from this? Does this, keep the status quo at the very least, or do we stand to benefit from this? If we do, okay, we'll agree to it. If we don't, then we'll walk away from it, because they may just want to walk away and have the excuse to have an arms race because they think they'll financially benefit and somehow the US economy will benefit, which of course the US economy is so destroyed it won't make a scrap of difference. So that's what drives policy decisions. And it's the same with big corporations. They're the ones that drive policy decisions, because which is why Trump wants all the businesses to come home from China. They're going, no, we're not doing it. We're staying here because it financially benefits us to do so. There's no incentive in the current climate to bring the business home, because we're going to lose out financially. We're going to have to spend enormous amounts on infrastructure to build new sort of operations inside the United States. So why would they do it? Of course, they don't want to do it. So, this is a big part of what's a controlling influence in a nation. So ultimately, it's, in the military industrial complex, for want of a better word, that's going to drive the US policy on this. But again, it's another example where, clearly they walked away from the 1987 INF treaty because they wanted to start escalating weapons development, and they literally walked away, and 2 weeks later they were doing things. So they were clearly in breach of it anyway, because you couldn't suddenly do missile testing for weapons that were in breach of it 2 weeks before and weren't in breach of it, then. So they were telegraphing their intentions very, very clearly. But again, what's the driving force? The military-industrial complex. That's the one that drives the US to go to for regime change in nations. That's what drives US foreign policy predominantly. And it's not, there isn't some big geostrategic move in this regard. That's why the US collectively makes these huge mistakes, because the driving force behind it is just, well, we can destabilize this nation. We can drag it into our umbrella. We can put it in NATO. We can put more bases there, more missiles. It's all money, 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 money. It's all money driven, not strategically driven, which is why the whole thing collapses and fails, and why Ukraine was an abysmal failure, because the whole plan there was consume the whole nation, suck it into NATO, put it into the European Union, move our threat to the Russian border on another front. Of course, the whole thing's failed, and now Ukraine is an utter failed state. I mean, it's failed on levels for a European nation, which is staggering. But that's what happens when your policy decision is driven by military expenditure and economics, and not driven by geopolitical, whether you agree with it or not, but by sound geopolitical principles was why you would engage with nations. And at the end of the day, the US could have just as easily not done any of this. It would have been in a far stronger position by not doing it, but it makes these moves, and it's been cutting off its nose to spite its face and shooting itself in the head, torso, and foot for pretty much it with regards to Europe for the last decade or so. And it's all been aimed at Russia, and it's all blowing up in their face very badly. And in many ways, Putin was a little bit naive, for want of a better word, in the early 2000s, where he actually thought, maybe I could, join alliances. At one point, he even said, well, maybe we could join NATO. Maybe, he kind of had this idealistic view that somehow you can integrate with the US, which of course was never a reality, but got to the late 2000, sort of 8, 9, 10, and then the whole sort of Arab Spring, and then the Russians went, well, it's pointless, it's never going to work. And I'm kind of surprised they ever thought it would work, because pretty much history since World War II has proved that with the US foreign policies, it's my way or the highway.
Yeah, and we see that, unfortunately, time and time again. I wish that the President Trump could speak, more to this in public versus some of the, I don't want to call them attacks, but just more the defense, in regards to Fauci and Biden, some of these attempts that if he could, here's where I think that he could win some of the discussions, or even attempt to enlighten the majority of people to say, look, I want to bring our troops home from Afghanistan, but every time I attempt to, or I talk about our troops coming home by Christmas, these events unfold, and why. And I guess he did share a little bit around that in regards to the military industrial complex. But for some reason, and I'm not sure if it's a lack of, I don't want to question the intelligence, but maybe just more of the information of the U.S. electorate, that he can't speak to those because they're very disconnected from it as far as an understanding. But I think what could resonate is an era of peace and prosperity, and then also just share some of the ideas that, for the trillions of dollars that the United States has spent on these foreign intervention policies, these wars, we could have more than paid for a student loan program. We more so could have paid for healthcare systems, all these things that the Biden campaign wants, and that resonates with a lot of the Democratic base. We could have paid for it at least a couple of times already if we wouldn't have these policies in place, Paul. But I'm not sure who advises the campaign, who gives this information. But I just think, again, it's just a lack of proper people to advise the campaign on some of these topics. And to me, that one's just a real no-brainer.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And that's another reason why I keep, we have this idea of all this one world governance and all these really smart, intelligent operators, these Western power brokers that extend their influence, and that somehow they really on the ball and know what they're doing. Well, they absolutely don't. They are so moronic and short-sighted, myopic and arrogant and ignorant. Because if they'd actually, as you said, if they hadn't gone on all these pointless wars, and I say pointless because I don't want to trivialize the damage that's being caused in terms of loss of life to infrastructure, to people displaced and all the things that always happen. The point is, if they'd actually taken that money and invested it in the United States, when the world would buy US debt and give them $3, which of course the world won't do anymore, which is why the US printing press is now in overdrive. But if they'd done that, rebuilt America, it would have been ready for when the inevitable situation happened. The empire was going to collapse. It overextended itself. It would have actually not overextended itself, and it could have been a very prosperous nation internally. It could have had a great dynamic market. It could have had all the things that it should have had, and the world would have looked upon it in a far greater light. It would have been a positive force for change, a great nation amongst equals. But because it had the harebrained idea that it was going to just impose its will on the rest of the world at any cost, it now finds itself in a situation where it's collapsing, and it's been in collapse mode. I mean, 2008 was the end, really. I mean, they just defied gravity for as long as they could, but in the end, and ironically, we're back to this point, really, the whole policy of how the West handled the coronavirus has destroyed what's left. What's left of the Western Empire, the dollar, US hegemony is gone, and that has been the catalyst for it. Because again, they made the completely wrong decisions, which not that they could have staved off because the economic collapse was coming, but they've just accelerated and made it an awful lot worse because they're incapable of making the right decisions. And it's like someone said to me only today, I struggle to find why you say about how incompetent the West is. And I flipped it on its head and said to them, well, tell me whenever in your lifetime have you ever seen Western governments, and I mean whoever controls them, when have they ever made the right decisions in your lifetime? And they said to me, well, never. I said, well, there you go. That proves the point that they are absolutely useless and clueless. The only thing the US had really was the dollar, which was a very blunt instrument to go around beating the world with. But once the world turned around and actually said, why are we buying US dollars? Why are we propping the United States up? This is ridiculous. Okay, there was the whole Gaddafi thing and Saddam Hussein, but 2014, 15, that's when the world stopped buying US dollars or treasuries and go, no, we're not doing this. Enough is enough. And of course, once they stopped doing that, the US was put it into utter terminal decline. And that's all they ever had to do. So equally, the world had sat there and said, we're not going to tolerate this and put up with this. But the US position was so fragile. And in the end, of course, you can only keep beating the rest of the world with a stick before they turn around and go, and we're not having this anymore. So they made enormously stupid policy decisions. And the US could have kept the dollar. The US could have been a force for good. It could have had a powerful influence on the world in a positive way. But it chose the path of destruction, death, grand larceny in the end. Of course, it failed. But so that is not the policy of an intelligent kind of deep state who actually made the right decisions. And in the short term, people say, well, look at all the money they made. Well, as I've said recently, what wealth? Yeah, you've destroyed the dollar. Yeah, they may have businesses with, on paper at least, huge multi-billionaires or whatever. But the point is, it's paper wealth. The paper wealth's all going to get flushed away. So what are they going to have? Nothing. They'll end up destroying everything because of stupidity. But It's the same with any empire. It collapses for me because of arrogance, ignorance, and also because it abuses the very people that made that empire to the point, the people turn around and refuse to accept it anymore. That's why the US empires collapsed very quickly. Even in relative terms, I mean, it really only came into ascendancy at the end of World War II. And since then, it actually at that point it was already in decline, and that was caused, probably pre-World War II. It was in decline. Okay, it abused its position to achieve dollar hegemony effectively at the end of World War II in Bretton Woods. But ever since then, it was in decline, and because it made all the wrong policy decisions, which therefore shows that the real policy makers in the US were not very bright or intelligent. In fact, they were anything but that. And in some ways, we should be grateful that the insanity that's infested this world for far too long is incapable of making those right decisions. But that's what I find very, very puzzling, is how much of the so-called alt media loves to present this image of them being omnipotent, all powerful. They're extending their influence all around the world, and they can, there's a one world governance, and they're all in control. So, my question straight back to anyone who says that, well, explain that in the context of Russia, China, and Iran, and they have no answer. And I said, well, therefore, it's not a one world governance, because I've just given you three nations straight off. What about all the ASEAN nations? When I add up, I can give you 4.5 billion people in this world who don't fall into any form of governance. Look at Europe. Europe couldn't be any more distant. Europe's distancing itself from the sort of Western Empire kind of US hegemony kind of mentality. There's another example. It's all fractured. Africa's not under the influence of this. So what exactly is the extent of this one world governance? It doesn't exist, and it never has existed. But there seems to be this idea that keeps populating that it's reality, and it's skewed a lot of people's perspective as to what's going on now in relation to this pandemic, etc., etc. And it's not reality, because if then people say they're going to move the empire to China. Well, if that was true, why are they trying to destroy China? Why are they trying to destroy Russia? Why are they trying to cripple Iran? Because China, Russia, Iran are three of the main fulcrum points of the whole Eurasian axis, which then moves into, obviously, the Middle East, etc. Germany is the other one, which is why they try to constantly undermine Germany and try to make Germany sanction Europe to Russia, to try and break up and prevent Nord Stream 2, etc., because, again, that's another, nail in the coffin of the Western Empire. The Eurasian axis destroys it. It finishes it. So there is no one world governance. There never was. There never will be. There never has been. As we said, the US tried it in 1944, the back end of the war, around the Bretton Woods time. And Britain and Russia said, no, this is never happening. We're not entertaining that idea. Why? Because they didn't want to lose their sovereignty. They didn't want to feel they were losing any influence or control over their own affairs. And ever since then, it's never been reality. So no, China, Russia, Putin, Xi are not playing some 4D cabal chess game to fool everyone, because history proves it. Recent events prove it, and here's the point: why does everyone think suddenly the US turned China into public enemy number one? Because they're on the same side as each other in some grand chess game above nation state? Absolutely not. And look at what's happened. How is that even feasible or possible that we could ever entertain that idea? Because it just doesn't stack up. And as I say, when I mention these nations, to anyone who says that, they just go quiet and they go, I said, well, you haven't got an answer, have you? No. Well, why? So do you think maybe your theory about this might be wrong? But they'll never go as far as saying that.
Correct.
And then a week later, they're still believing it. Well, sometimes you just have to let go of things that maybe, in fact, if your belief, I don't want to use the Q thing as a great example, but that's a great one. people just keep believing it. Even when time after time, month after month, year after year, everything they've ever believed in never happens. They just won't let go of it.
Hmm.
They're convinced it's going to happen, even though, how many years do you keep giving it, some credence that it might just happen? But that's what happens when people get sucked into belief systems. They'll never let it go, even in the face of all the evidence that supports to the contrary.
Yeah, very well said, Paul. Paul, thank you so much for a great discussion. And for our Gadfly subscribers, please comment directly on this video or over in the forums. And Paul, any closing thoughts before we wrap up this session?
Yeah, you've always summed it up best. Look, we're in the empire of chaos, and the chaos extends across the world in different ways. And it was said to me a decade ago in conversations I had, look, this day's coming. You know it economically and geopolitically. And at that point, there was enough writing on the wall for me. But the important point was, don't get sucked into the noise. Don't get sucked into all these grandiose ideas about what's unfolding. And, and unfortunately, the pandemic was a great way of trying to reverse engineer a story and put all this dystopian idea into the equation, and when none of it actually stacks up in reality. And the problem is, don't get sucked into the noise of things. Okay, we all make our choices. If people want to, that's fine. But I know people, and I said this to you before we came on air, CJ, that there's people we know on a personal level who've been consumed by this, and the damage it's doing to them on an individual basis in terms of their families, in terms of their relationships, is very, very concerning to me. And I said to them, don't walk into this, because it will consume you. And I'm seeing a lot of people consumed by ideas that don't have basis in reality. And when we actually discuss the reality of things, if there's a shred of thing, anything you think that casts doubt on it, then just walking away from it, I don't think is a good idea. But anyway, at the end of the day, people make their own decisions. We're not here to tell people what to think or what to do. But from my perspective, be very careful being sucked into, because I've said this before, at this point, there's a war on for people's minds. And it doesn't just extend to the mainstream media and governments and all those kind of institutions that we know have been playing people for decades and beyond. It extends to everything. And don't assume that anything that appears to oppose conventional mainstream media or government is on your side, because there are things out there that are not on your side. And the plain simple fact is, we challenge this. And those entities that are not on your side made very serious threats against us with regards to this, as I've said previously with Ken. So that should make people go, why would you be threatened? Well, because there's vested interest out there for the war on our minds. So maybe you won't take any notice of it, or maybe people do. But for me, it was a very clear affirmation. We're doing the right thing by opposing the viewpoint that it's a planned epidemic.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Paul, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, and likewise.